Mrs. Collins, why are you pretending you don't know? Those were the words that stopped me cold before I could even ask why my debit card had been declined for a simple grocery purchase. I stood at the polished marble counter, still holding the reusable shopping bag I'd carried in from my car, wondering if the young teller had confused me with someone else. At 68 years old, I had learned not to panic over small inconveniences. Cards expired. Computers made mistakes. Banks had outages. There was always a reasonable explanation. At least, that's what I believed until the branch manager walked out of his office with an expression that told me my ordinary Thursday morning was about to become the day everything I thought I knew about my life unraveled. My name is Margaret Collins. I had been a widow for almost 7 years. Since my husband, Thomas, passed away, I lived quietly in the same modest Ohio home where we had raised our only son, Daniel. I stretched every dollar. I clipped coupons every Sunday. I drove the same 12-year-old sedan because I couldn't imagine spending money on something newer. When my blood pressure medication increased in price last winter, I stopped buying fresh salmon and switched to canned tuna. I never complained. Daniel worked hard, and I didn't want him worrying about me. His wife, Emily, always assured me she was helping behind the scenes. "Don't worry about paperwork, Margaret," she would say with a warm smile. "I'll handle the banking notices whenever something comes in." It must be overwhelming doing everything alone. I believed her because that's what families do. They trust each other. That morning, I had simply planned to withdraw $300 to cover utilities, groceries, and a small birthday gift for my neighbor's grandson. Instead, the teller quietly asked me to wait. A minute later, the bank manager approached and extended his hand. "Mrs. Collins? I'm Michael Harper. Would you mind stepping into my office?" His voice was calm, respectful, almost careful. Inside the office, he closed the door but didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he studied a folder on his desk before looking back at me. "I apologize if this sounds unusual," he said gently, "but according to our records, you've visited this branch several times over the past 6 years regarding your estate accounts." I stared at him, certain I had misunderstood. "I've never been here before," I answered. "I usually bank through the drive-thru when I need cash." He frowned, not with suspicion, but with genuine confusion. "Mrs. Collins, are you absolutely certain?" I nodded. "I've never met you." He slowly turned his computer monitor toward himself again, reviewing something line by line. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Finally, he looked back at me, his expression now carrying something that felt dangerously close to concern. "Then I think we need to talk," he said quietly. "Because according to every document in front of me, someone has been making very important financial decisions in your name for years." My heartbeat quickened, but I still searched for an innocent explanation. Maybe there had been clerical errors. Maybe my late husband's records had been mixed with someone else's. I wanted to believe that. I needed to believe that. Then Michael opened a thick file, carefully sliding the first document across the polished desk. He tapped a single signature at the bottom of the page before meeting my eyes again. "Mrs. Collins," he said softly, "before we go any further, I need you to answer one question as honestly as you can. Did you personally authorize someone else to manage your entire financial future?" I looked down at the signature on the document for several long seconds before I finally shook my head. "That is my name," I whispered, "but I did not sign this." Michael Harper did not interrupt me. He simply nodded, as though he had already begun to suspect that answer. He carefully removed 3 more documents from the folder and placed them side by side across the desk. Every page carried my name. Every signature looked almost identical. If I had glanced at them quickly, I probably would have believed they were mine as well. My hands started trembling anyway. "There has to be some mistake," I said. "I have never authorized anyone to take over my accounts." Michael folded his hands together. "Mrs. Collins, I would like to ask you something that may seem personal. Does anyone regularly help you with your financial mail, your banking correspondence, or official documents?" I immediately thought of Emily. Ever since Thomas passed away, she had insisted that I should not burden myself with complicated paperwork. She said the world had become too digital for someone my age and that she was happy to organize everything for me. Whenever an envelope from the bank arrived, she smiled, slipped it into her purse, and promised she would explain it during her next visit. I remembered thanking her more times than I could count. I believed I was fortunate to have such a thoughtful daughter-in-law. Sitting in that quiet office, those memories no longer felt comforting. They felt strangely heavy. Michael turned his monitor toward me again. A timeline filled the screen. Transactions. Account updates. Changes to mailing preferences. New authorizations. The dates stretched back almost 6 years. "I am not showing you this to frighten you," he said calmly. "I simply believe you deserve to know exactly what has been happening." My eyes followed each line, but the numbers barely registered. One detail did. Every notification connected to my estate accounts had been redirected to another mailing address years earlier. I blinked several times before reading it again. It was Daniel and Emily's address. "That cannot be right," I murmured. "I never changed my mailing address." Michael reached for another folder. According to these records, the request was submitted in person. My heart sank. In person. I searched my memory, trying to recall every visit I had ever made to a bank branch after Thomas died. There were almost none. I preferred simple routines. I deposited checks through the automated machine. I withdrew cash from the drive-thru. I avoided paperwork because Emily always insisted she would handle it. Suddenly, dozens of little moments I had ignored began fitting together. Emily gently asking whether she could stop by before I checked my mailbox. Emily volunteering to file my taxes. Emily reminding me not to worry about legal forms because everything was already organized. At the time, every gesture had seemed generous. Now each memory carried a question I had never thought to ask. Michael quietly slid one final document toward me. "Mrs. Collins, before we continue, I recommend that we verify every signature together and review every authorization from the beginning. If these instructions were made without your informed consent, there are procedures available to protect your interests. But first, we need to understand the full picture." I looked out the office window toward the parking lot where my aging sedan sat beneath the bright morning sun. For years I had believed I was simply a widow doing her best to survive on limited savings. For the first time, I wondered whether I had been living inside a story someone else had carefully written for me. Michael excused himself for a few minutes to retrieve additional records, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the office air conditioner and the steady ticking of a wall clock that suddenly seemed much louder than before. I folded my hands together to stop them from shaking, but the memories would not stop coming. They arrived one after another, each one carrying a meaning I had completely missed at the time. I remembered the afternoon Emily insisted on helping me organize my filing cabinet. She smiled as she sorted every folder into neat stacks across my dining room table. "You have enough to worry about," she had said. "I enjoy paperwork. Let me keep everything simple for you." At the end of the afternoon, several folders had disappeared into a large envelope that she promised to review at home. I never asked for them back. A few months later, I received a letter from the county property office. Before I even opened it, Emily reached for the envelope with her usual cheerful confidence. "Probably another routine notice," she laughed. "I will explain it when I finish reading it." She placed it inside her purse while I continued making coffee, never imagining that I had just watched another piece of my own life quietly leave my kitchen. There had been other moments as well. Every birthday, Daniel would ask how I was managing financially. Before I could answer, Emily would smile and tell him that everything was under control. "Your mother is doing just fine," she would say. "She is actually saving money because she hardly spends anything." Daniel always looked relieved. I never corrected her because I did not want my son to worry. Looking back now, I wondered how many conversations had ended before I even realized I should have spoken. Last winter, when my furnace needed repairs, I told Emily I might have to postpone replacing several worn windows because I simply could not afford both expenses. She squeezed my hand and told me that living within my means was something to be proud of. I remember feeling embarrassed that I had even mentioned money. Today, that conversation echoed differently. If someone had known the true condition of my finances, why encourage me to continue believing I could barely make ends meet? The office door opened quietly, and Michael returned carrying another binder filled with neatly organized records. He placed it on the desk without rushing. "I spent a little extra time reviewing everything," he said. "The pattern is becoming much clearer." He opened the binder to a page containing copies of official correspondence. Every notification had been redirected. Every account update had been acknowledged. Every important communication had reached someone, just not me. My chest tightened as I realized this had not happened once or twice. It had become a routine that stretched across years. Michael pointed to a column of dates. "Mrs. Collins, whoever managed these communications remained remarkably consistent." There were no gaps. I stared at the pages in silence. My life had not changed overnight. It had changed one envelope at a time, one signature at a time, one quiet decision after another. I had mistaken convenience for kindness and trust for security. As painful as that realization was, an even more unsettling thought slowly settled into my mind. If these records were only the beginning, then I still had no idea how much of my life had been quietly rewritten without my knowledge. Michael did not pressure me to respond immediately. He understood that the hardest part was not reading the documents. It was accepting that they belonged to my life. He quietly arranged the papers into chronological order and handed me a yellow legal pad. "Sometimes writing down dates helps people remember details they had forgotten," he said. I took the pen and slowly began listing the years after Thomas passed away. The first Christmas without him. Daniel and Emily insisting that I spend every holiday at their house because they did not want me to feel lonely. The spring when Emily suggested simplifying all of my finances because, in her words, stress was not good for my heart. The summer she offered to drive me to appointments and collect my mail whenever I traveled to visit my sister. None of those memories had seemed unusual before today. Together they formed a pattern that I could no longer ignore. Michael opened another section of the binder. Inside were copies of account summaries I had never seen. My eyes widened as I read the balances. They were far larger than I expected. For years I believed Thomas had left only enough for me to live carefully if I avoided unnecessary expenses. Instead, the accounts reflected investments that had continued growing steadily. There had never been a need for me to skip medications or postpone home repairs. There had never been a reason to feel guilty for buying a new winter coat or replacing my aging water heater. Someone had allowed me to believe I was struggling while knowing the truth was entirely different. I felt an unexpected wave of sadness rather than anger. I thought about the evenings I sat alone at my kitchen table calculating grocery costs with a small calculator Thomas had once kept in his workshop. I remembered choosing generic brands because every dollar mattered. I remembered quietly declining invitations from old friends because restaurant dinners seemed too expensive. Those decisions had shaped my life for years. They had not been necessary. They had been built on information that had been carefully hidden from me. Michael pointed toward another page containing authorized contacts. "Mrs. Collins, there is something else you should know," he said. "Your son is not listed as the primary contact on these accounts. Someone specifically requested that another person receive routine communications first." I closed my eyes for a moment. Daniel had always asked whether I needed help. His concern had sounded sincere. If he had known the truth, why would he continue asking the same questions? A quiet thought settled into my mind. Perhaps he had never seen these records either. Perhaps trust had been misplaced by more than one person. Michael seemed to sense the direction of my thoughts. "Please do not reach conclusions until every document has been reviewed," he said gently. "Facts are stronger than assumptions." I appreciated those words because they reminded me of something Thomas often repeated during difficult times. Slow down. Look at the whole picture before deciding what it means. I folded my hands across the binder and took a slow breath. For the first time that morning, I stopped feeling like a frightened widow and started feeling like someone searching for the truth. Whatever had happened over the past 6 years had not happened in a single afternoon. It had been built patiently, one decision after another. If I wanted my life back, I would have to uncover every step of that journey with the same patience that had once been used to hide it. When Michael reached the final section of the binder, he paused before turning the next page. That small hesitation told me whatever came next mattered more than everything I had already seen. He carefully slid a document toward me, keeping one finger on the bottom corner. "Mrs. Collins," he said quietly, "this paperwork was prepared only a few months ago, but according to our records, it has never been completed." I lowered my eyes to the title. It was not another bank authorization or investment summary. It was a financial planning packet connected to long-term residential care. My stomach tightened. I read each line twice before the meaning finally settled in. Someone had requested estimates for selling my home, transferring portions of my estate, and coordinating future living arrangements. There was even a projected timeline that suggested these changes could happen within the next year. I looked at Michael in disbelief. "I have never spoken to anyone about leaving my house," I said. "I still mow my own lawn. I drive myself to church every Sunday. I take care of my garden." He nodded gently. "Nothing in your banking history suggests that you are incapable of managing your affairs. That is one reason these documents caught my attention." My thoughts drifted back to several conversations that had seemed harmless at the time. Emily had casually mentioned how peaceful some retirement communities looked. Another afternoon, she remarked that maintaining an older home must be exhausting for someone my age. I laughed and changed the subject because I loved my little house. Thomas and I planted every maple tree in the yard ourselves. Every room held memories that could never be replaced. I had assumed Emily was simply making conversation. Sitting in that office, those remarks no longer felt casual. They sounded like pieces of a plan that had been developing quietly for years. "Who requested these estimates?" I finally asked. Michael looked at the file for a long moment before answering carefully. "I cannot make accusations based on incomplete information. However, I can tell you that these inquiries were made by someone who claimed to be assisting with your financial affairs." He closed the binder and folded his hands. "Mrs. Collins, I have worked in banking for more than 20 years. Most financial mistakes happen because people ignore small warning signs. You did not ignore them. You never had the chance to see them." Those words stayed with me. I had spent years blaming myself for not saving enough, for not planning better, for becoming too cautious with every dollar. Yet the truth unfolding in front of me suggested that my greatest mistake had not been poor financial planning. It had been trusting someone else to stand between me and the information that belonged to me. Even then, I refused to let bitterness take control. I thought about Daniel. If he had known everything, why would he still ask whether I needed help paying my heating bill? Why would he offer to repair my porch every spring? The questions no longer pointed in only one direction. They pointed toward something larger that had not yet been uncovered. Michael stood and walked toward the office window before speaking again. "I believe the next step should be taken carefully," he said. "Do not tell anyone about today's meeting until you understand every document. Once people know that hidden information has been discovered, they often change their behavior." I slowly nodded. For the first time since walking into the bank that morning, I understood that learning the truth was only the beginning. Protecting it would require patience, silence, and the courage to keep listening before saying a single word. When I finally walked out of the bank, the afternoon sun looked exactly the same as it had when I arrived, yet nothing inside me felt familiar anymore. I sat behind the wheel of my old sedan for several minutes without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel while my mind replayed every conversation I had shared with Emily over the past 6 years. It would have been easy to drive straight to Daniel's house and demand answers. It would have been easy to confront everyone while my emotions were still raw. Instead, I remembered Michael's advice. Facts first, emotions later. That evening I followed my normal routine with deliberate care. I watered the flowers Thomas and I had planted beside the front porch. I prepared a simple dinner and ate alone at the small oak table where we had shared thousands of meals together. Nothing about my evening appeared unusual. Around 7 o'clock, Daniel called to check on me. His voice sounded warm, just as it always had. He asked whether I needed anything from the grocery store and reminded me that Emily planned to stop by the following afternoon to help organize some household paperwork. For a brief moment, I closed my eyes. Household paperwork. The phrase carried an entirely different meaning now. "That sounds fine," I answered calmly. "I will be home." After we hung up, I stared at my telephone for a long time. Daniel had not sounded like a man hiding a secret. If anything, he sounded like a son who believed everything was perfectly normal. That realization gave me a small measure of hope. Perhaps trust had been misplaced by more than one person. The next morning, I returned to the bank as Michael had requested. This time, he introduced me to Benjamin Carter, an attorney who specialized in estate and financial matters. Benjamin greeted me with quiet professionalism and explained that his role was not to accuse anyone, but to help determine exactly which documents reflected my genuine intentions. Together, we reviewed each authorization one by one. Benjamin asked careful questions about meetings I supposedly attended, forms I supposedly completed, and decisions I supposedly made. My answers remained consistent. I had never approved those changes because I had never even known they existed. By late afternoon, a clear timeline had begun to emerge. Certain account notifications had been redirected first. Then additional authorizations appeared months later. Finally, larger financial decisions followed after communication with me had become almost completely dependent upon someone else. Benjamin leaned back in his chair and quietly folded his notes. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "whoever arranged these changes understood that controlling information can be more powerful than controlling money. When someone decides what another person is allowed to know, every future decision becomes easier to influence." Those words stayed with me long after the meeting ended. I had always believed independence meant paying my own bills, maintaining my own home, and driving my own car. I had never realized true independence also required direct access to the truth. Before I left, Michael handed me a sealed envelope containing copies of every important record we had reviewed together. "Keep these somewhere safe," he said. "Do not mention them yet." Sometimes the clearest answers appear only after people believe nothing has changed. I carefully placed the envelope inside my handbag and thanked both men for treating me with dignity instead of pity. As I walked toward the parking lot once again, I realized that for the first time in many years, I was no longer simply reacting to my circumstances. Quietly, patiently, and without saying a single word to anyone at home, I had begun taking my own life back. 3 days later, everything changed without anyone realizing it except me. Emily arrived at my house carrying her usual leather folder and a bright smile. She hugged me, complimented the flowers on the porch, and immediately asked whether I had received any new mail from the bank. I smiled just as warmly and told her that nothing unusual had arrived. It was true. Nothing had arrived because every important communication was finally coming directly to me through secure channels arranged by Michael and Benjamin. Emily walked into my dining room as though she had done it 100 times before. She opened her folder and casually mentioned that there were a few routine forms that would make my finances easier to manage in the future. Months earlier, I would have signed them without hesitation. This time, I adjusted my reading glasses and quietly read every page from beginning to end. I noticed the smallest details now. Words that once seemed harmless carried enormous weight. Every signature represented control. Every authorization represented trust. I placed the papers back on the table and smiled politely. "I think I would like my attorney to review these first," I said. For the first time since she entered my home, Emily's expression changed. It lasted only a second before she recovered her smile, but I noticed it. "Of course," she answered. "I just thought I could save you the trouble." I thanked her for her concern and changed the subject to Daniel's work. She left less than 15 minutes later. That evening, my telephone rang. It was Daniel. He sounded confused rather than upset. "Mom," he said, "Emily mentioned that you suddenly wanted a lawyer to review your paperwork. Is everything all right?" I listened carefully to every word. There was no accusation in his voice, only genuine concern. "Everything is fine," I replied. I simply realized I should understand my own finances better. After a long pause, he quietly said something that confirmed what I had begun to suspect all along. "Honestly, Mom, I always assumed Emily handled all of that because she told me you preferred it that way." I closed my eyes for a moment. There it was. Not an admission of wrongdoing, but proof that information had traveled through one person before reaching everyone else. Daniel had trusted the same explanations I had trusted. The following afternoon, Benjamin called with the final review of my records. Every major account had now been secured under my direct control. Mailing addresses had been restored. New verification procedures had been activated. Any future changes would require my personal approval. For the first time in years, my financial life belonged entirely to me again. A week later, Daniel came to visit alone. We sat on the back porch, watching the breeze move through the maple trees his father had planted decades earlier. I handed him copies of the documents and quietly asked him to read them at his own pace. He said nothing for several minutes. When he finally looked up, his eyes reflected sadness more than shock. "Mom," he whispered, "I did not know." I believed him. Some truths reveal betrayal. Others reveal how easily trust can be redirected when people stop asking questions. I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. "Your father always told us that honesty does not become valuable when life is easy," I said. "It becomes valuable when the truth is uncomfortable." I never raised my voice. I never demanded revenge. I simply reclaimed the right to know my own story. Looking back now, I understand that money was never the greatest thing I nearly lost. It was my independence. The day I chose to seek answers instead of accepting assumptions, I began rebuilding something far more valuable than any bank account. I began rebuilding myself.